1990. Luna Park on Sydney's foreshore had been closed and left abandoned for 2 years, on the verge of being demolished and lost to time. Once a bustling institution of Sydney decades ago, it was now a decaying relic of a past era, slowly being reclaimed by the natural environment that surrounded the park. For over a decade, the park was in and out of trouble following the Ghost Train fire of 1979. But now it seemed like the park was finally going to be gone for good. (1991). Luna Park has now been abandoned for 3 years, however with plans for the future. The previous owners of the lease, Australian Amusements Associates, controversially won a state government tender to operate Luna Park a decade prior in 1980, and operated it from 1982 until 1988. While operating the park, Australian Amusements showed a severe lack of care for numerous attractions on the site, effectively neglecting numerous areas of the park, particularly the historic Coney Island at the back of the park, as well as rides that were retained from the park's golden age, such as the Rotor. After closing Luna Park in 1988, Australian Amusements, still owners of the lease, essentially spent years doing nothing with the park and let it decay. The end goal of their operation was dubious: to demolish Luna Park and redevelop the site for different use. A battle the park had faced for decades by this point. The government, however, had something else in mind. In the 10 years on from 1979, they realised that they had a history to preserve at Luna Park, and that if Australian Amusements were to hold the lease further, this history may end up decaying to the point of no return. As such, the state government would end up creating the Luna Park Site Act to essentially terminate Australian Amusements' lease of the park and return Luna Park to public hands once again. In the act, the government created a new legal entity to manage the park. This would end up being the Luna Park Reserve Trust. The purpose of the creation of the trust was simple: to preserve and reopen Luna Park as an amusement and recreational precinct by 1993, and in turn protect numerous historical aspects of Luna Park for future generations to enjoy. Using a budget of $25 million, the Reserve Trust got to work right away on the project. To operate the new Luna Park, the Reserve Trust would strike a $20 million deal with showman Des Whittingslow and his company Whittingslow Amusements, an experienced carnival ride operator with decades of experience in the field, to operate the amusement section of the park. A new amusement company, Luna Park Amusements, would be created as a partnership between the Reserve Trust and Whittingslow. This partnership would help significantly in the acquisition of new rides for the park. 5 flat rides owned by Whittingslow found new lives at Luna Park. Most of these would be named and themed after classic Luna Park attractions: a Huss Troika named Tumblebug, a Huss Breakdance named Spider, and a Huss UFO named Flying Saucer. A Huss Rainbow ride was originally going to be installed at the park, however would end up being swapped out with a Huss Ranger at the last minute. Rounding out the ex-Whittingslow rides was the Octopus, hastily placed at the foot of Big Dipper. A few new kids' rides were added at the very front of the park, which were also named after former Luna Park rides, particularly the U-Drive and the Whirler. Carrying over from the previous incarnation of the park would be the Ferris wheel and the Tango Train. A classic ride of Luna Park, operating from 1959 until 1970, was the Wild Mouse. Constructed by the park themselves based on a European design, it was initially removed after 1970 and installed at the Sydney Showgrounds at Moore Park, where it would operate during the Sydney Royal Easter Show every year until the early 1990s. As part of the restoration, the Luna Park Authority purchased the old Wild Mouse, relocating the roller coaster piece by piece back to Luna Park and reinstalling it in its original position. The Rotor, a popular ride that operated from 1951 until 1986, would also make its return, constructed to a new design that was slightly smaller than the original attraction. At the back of the park is Coney Island, an opening day attraction Coney Island was built as a funhouse featuring various small attractions and slides. While a bustling component of the park in its golden era, Coney Island was subject to immense neglect by Luna Park's previous owners and had clearly seen better days in the early 1990s. One of the main priorities of reopening Luna Park was the restoration of Coney Island, and millions of dollars would be invested in restoring the attraction and its artworks to original condition, making Coney Island look brand new once again. The neighbouring Crystal Palace building, once housing the park's dodgems in a past era, was restored externally. However, due to budget cuts, the full restoration was shelved. In Luna Park's heyday, the biggest attraction of them all was the Big Dipper, the park's signature roller coaster that operated from opening day in 1935 until 1979. No resurrection of Luna Park would be complete without a Big Dipper, and from the outset, plans for a new roller coaster were a main priority of the Luna Park restoration. Luna Park Amusements would scour roller coaster builders around the world to manufacture the new Big Dipper, ultimately selecting Aerodynamics, a household name in the amusement world, with dozens of giant roller coasters built to their name, including the Magnum XL200 and Steel Phantom, the world's tallest and fastest roller coasters at the time. With little land to work with to build the new roller coaster, Aero specifically designed the new roller coaster to fit into the park's small footprint, with the Reserve Trust even acquiring some ex-state rail land to expand the roller coaster's layout. Built at a cost of $10 million, or about $20 million when adjusted for inflation, the end product was one of Australia's tallest and longest roller coasters, standing at an impressive 40 metres. The views of the harbour from the top of the chain lift would have no doubt been impressive. Following a turn off the lift hill, it would hit the first drop at about 85 kilometres an hour, before going through two overbank curves, flying through the recreated Big Dipper Tower, and past a recreated River Caves mountain. Then, the coaster would snake through the back of the park, before diving into a 90 degrees upwards helix behind Coney Island, going through a dive loop and a vertical loop, before a small hill and a turn into the brake run. Being a relatively large roller coaster that operated at night, from the day it was announced, neighbours in surrounding residential towers were at odds with its installation. It was feared that the new roller coaster would create significant noise while operating at the park, with the Reserve Trust themselves admitting that with the Big Dipper installed, the park could not meet the 65 decibel operating limit set by the Environmental Protection Authority, instead offering to install soundproofing in the affected residences in exchange to relax the sound limit to allow the Big Dipper to operate, seemingly resolving the issue for the time being. The reconstruction of Luna Park eventually fell well behind schedule, and well over budget. Negotiations between Winslow and the Reserve Trust were tempestuous at best, and frequently broke down, not finalising an operational arrangement until just a few months before the park opened. Construction went significantly over budget, and eventually bank loans would be required in order to complete construction of the park by its deadline. As early as 1993, the Reserve Trust began shifting opening dates further and further down the line, first in the middle of 1994, then to the end of 1994, and finally the banks provided an ultimatum to the trust: open Luna Park by April 1995 or lose the loan. The budget would end up blowing out to almost double the predicted amount, at an estimated $49 million. Luna Park would eventually reopen to the public on the 20th of January 1995. The press heralded the reopening, and the park would reopen to record turnouts in spite of the poor weather conditions on that weekend. It seemed that years and years of effort had finally paid off. While the noise issues with Big Dipper were seemingly fixed in 1994, things would go pear-shaped very quickly. Noise monitoring by the EPA shortly after opening indicated that noise at nearby apartments would at times measure as high as 90 decibels. Around 80 to 100 more residences than the Trust's prediction would be adversely affected by the Big Dipper's operation. Homes in residential areas as far as Lavender Bay were also recording noise levels above the 65 decibel limit set by the EPA in 1994. Following these measurements, the EPA issued a pollution control license for operation of the park, restricting the operating hours of the ride to 52 hours per week during school holidays and 25 hours over weekends. In the background, a court case was filed against the Reserve Trust by numerous developers and residents, arguing the operation of the Big Dipper constituted a nuisance, seeking damages and the removal of the roller coaster from the park. When the decision was ultimately handed down towards the end of 1995, the decision argued that the Big Dipper's operation did indeed constitute a nuisance. and ordered that Luna Park could not operate the roller coaster outside the hours of 5:30 PM to 10 PM on Fridays, and 10 AM to 11 PM on Saturdays, limiting the operating hours of the coaster to even less than the EPA regulations. Luna Park Amusements tried to compromise, even offering to install scream shields on the roller coaster trains that may have impacted adversely on the experience. This would prove to be the point where Luna Park's commercial viability was thrown into serious doubt. In the construction phase, the Reserve Trust argued that the Big Dipper was a large component to Luna Park's commercial viability, and indeed they stated that the park will only operate when the roller coaster is operating. Attendance dropped by 30% from the previous months. By year's end, the amount of guests that would enter the gates in the new Luna Park's first year of operation wouldn't even come close to the 550,000 the Reserve Trust estimated. Combined with relatively bleak weather conditions that didn't make it easy for people to go to Luna Park over the holiday season, it was looking very grim for Luna Park. From the very beginning, the Luna Park Reserve Trust saw the importance of the Big Dipper in the viability of Luna Park in the long run. Without it, it was going to fail. Ultimately, this would end up proving to be true. Luna Park would close once again on the 14th of February 1996, just over a year after it reopened. Just like 5 years ago, Luna Park would sit there, unused and abandoned. The entire ordeal of the Luna Park operation was flawed from the start. Now, it is quite easy to put the blame for the park's failure on the neighbours being NIMBY types, using similar logic to people moving next to an established airport and then complaining about the noise, but it really isn't that simple. It could be seen that the Reserve Trust seemingly thought it could operate independently from the law, and the frequent pushbacks of deadlines for the trust to meet legal obligations, and assumptions that some things with the operation of the park would be done by somebody else rather than the trust themselves. The installation of a giant 40-meter roller coaster on the scale of the Big Dipper was a questionable and insensitive decision at the time, considering Arrow's experience building roller coasters of a smaller scale. In 1993, a year before the Big Dipper would be built, the Adventure Dome in Las Vegas built the Canyon Blaster, a large roller coaster that was custom built for that park, like Big Dipper itself. Standing just 29 meters tall, yet featuring a more intense and thrilling layout than Big Dipper, with a barrage of inversions, it is a living example that good roller coasters don't necessarily have to be big to make an impact. The design and construction process for the Big Dipper was flawed. In an audit carried out by the Auditor General by request of the government, it argued that as a result of the Reserve Trust wanting to involve themselves in the construction of the coaster, it adversely affected Luna Park in the following ways. It would ruin negotiations with the preferred operators Winslow. It would require a loan from the private sector to fund the construction of the ride and would use up $10 million of funds allocated to site restoration. Ultimately, it would lead to a more extensive deviation from the plan and subsequent delays in construction, and when it would eventually open in 1995, restrictions on the operating hours of the park. The ensuing court case would expose the government to litigation and its outcome in paying very expensive legal fees and compensation. A glaring flaw in the park's construction was the omission of an environmental impact statement in preparing the plan of management. The audit argues that public reaction to the plan may have been different if the public had been better informed of the noise, light, and parking impacts of the park. In preparing the plan, the Reserve Trust did not give proper consideration to the likelihood of a liability arising from the development of residential units adjacent to the park. The Reserve Trust considered the onus for noise amelioration would fall on the developers. During construction and restoration of the park, the Reserve Trust would frequently intervene. As described in a 1991 plan of management, the role of the trust was to act as a landlord, running with the private sector company the trust appointed being responsible for running the park for themselves under a lease. By 1994, the Reserve Trust essentially would operate the park themselves, being the majority shareholder of Luna Park Amusements, created due to the Reserve Trust specifically wanting control over the park, resulting in negotiations between them and Winslow stalling multiple times. This would rope the government into the operation unnecessarily, with them holding a majority of shares in Luna Park Amusements. Therefore, if the investment was to fail, the government would ultimately be liable. The Reserve Trust operated as a body that felt it was unaccountable to the government, and by extension, to the taxpayer. The Reserve Trust was still a public organisation after all. Its main purpose was to act as the caretaker for public land. As stated before, roughly around $10 million of state government grants that were allocated to the restoration of historical buildings at Luna Park would be misused and instead used to finish construction of the Big Dipper. When it came time for the Reserve Trust to be audited in order to provide some accountability to the government, it was found that the Reserve Trust chosen accounting firm that conducted that audit from 1993 until 1994 was Winningslow's personal accountant and auditor, which is rather suspicious for a public body. Ultimately, the Luna Park Reserve Trust, and by extension, the government, would get their hands involved in a commercial operation that they had no part of. This isn't to say the Reserve Trust was an evil body. As a matter of fact, they did far more good than bad in the 5-year Luna Park saga. 3 members of the trust were members of the Friends of Luna Park, a group that could be credited for helping save the park from the hands of developers in the late 80s. While researching this topic though, there were heaps of missteps in the construction of the park. The Reserve Trust simply bit off more than they could chew when rebuilding Luna Park. They went all in on their plans, built the biggest roller coaster in Australia, made everything look flashy and well presented. However, the trust could have done the development better. A slightly smaller roller coaster, a few less rides at opening to be added later in an expansion, and better communication with stakeholders from day one could have been a sustainable model that may have survived to the current day. We just don't know. A year following the park's closure, the Reserve Trust, wiped clean of its previous members, would once again look for a new operator. Finding new operators was difficult initially. The Big Dipper saga was a nightmare that nobody wanted to deal with. However, eventually, a tender was found. Metro Edgley won the tender to operate Luna Park under a lease from the Reserve Trust. Their plans called for most of the existing rides to stay on the site, minus the Big Dipper, which was to be replaced with a large multi-use music venue, and Crystal Palace to be redeveloped into a function centre. Luna Park would reopen a few times on brief occasions, primarily for charity events and filming, however opened for the final time prior to its renovation for 2 weeks during the Sydney 2000 Olympics. Construction work would begin in early 2001 with the removal of the Big Dipper from the park. The Big Dipper was sold to Macquarie Leisure Trust, who happened to be the owners of Dreamworld on the Gold Coast. In the winter of 2001, the Big Dipper was carefully removed from Luna Park before being moved up to Dreamworld and reconstructed, opening in its new home on Boxing Day 2001 as the Cyclone. The roller coaster is still in operation to this day at Dreamworld. The new operators shuffle around the remaining rides. The aforementioned venue, the Big Top, replaced most of the Big Dipper's footprint, while a handful of the rides, such as the Kids Rides, the Ranger and the Spider, that were displaced by new buildings in the park, were moved to the back section where the coaster's helix sat on. Octopus was removed and sold to Aussie World in Queensland, while Tumblebug was moved to the Big Dipper's former station platform. Rhoda and Tango Train were moved around from their original positions, while the Flying Saucer, Ferris Wheel and Wild Mouse all stayed in place. A number of the buildings were refurbished on the site. For example, the Wild Mouse's building that the coaster sat on was repainted to not look like a piece of cheese, and the Big Dipper Tower being oddly kept and repainted from red to blue. A lot of the statues and theming that adorned the rides in 1995 were eliminated when they were reshuffled around and plopped in other locations. Reopening in 2004, Luna Park remains in operation to this day. And this is how Luna Park operated until very recently with few changes. For a long time, it looked pretty bad, no different from a royal show. However, Metro Edgley, then Multiplex, wouldn't be making much of its business from the amusement portion. The Big Top is their cash cow, hosting many concerts and major events over the years, receiving constant bookings right up until the pandemic's beginning last year. Some rides were added over the years as Multiplex tried to make Luna Park their own, such as the Hairraiser Drop Tower in 2013, a new Tango Train in 2016, and Volare in 2018. However, was largely slowed down thanks to an endless parade of legal action from neighbours against any and all new ride additions. Progressively though, many of the older rides were removed. When they were initially installed in 1995, most of the ex-Winninglow rides that were brought to the park had for some years beforehand travelled from show to show around the country. Many of them were showing their age. Flying Saucer was removed after 2013, while the Tango Train was removed during 2016. Finally, the kids' rides, the Spider, the Ranger, and the Tumblebug were all removed at the end of 2020. None of these rides found new lives elsewhere. Most of them ended up being sold off to be used as parts for other rides. Following the failure of the 1995 restoration, it was deemed that legal action had forced Luna Park to shut after just 12 months was simply put unsustainable for the park's long-term future. As such, following another rebuild of the park in 2004, Luna Park was made legally protected from legal action relating to noise, following another lawsuit filed by the neighbours wanting a permanent ban on thrill rides that was thrown out almost immediately. This protection, as well as other regulations governing the park negotiated by Multiplex, the government and council, paved the way for the construction of the biggest investment in the park made since 1995, the installation of 7 new rides and the return of the Big Dipper, construction of which is well on the way and is expected to conclude at the end of 2021. Only time will tell if the events of 1995 will repeat themselves once more.